But we really need this to be as consistent as possible, and that's one of the big messages we're getting from the OEMs and industry. And you can understand why. We're not a big market by international standards, and the more that we fragment that market into different state-based requirements, the bigger trouble we'll have.
Okay, well, Michael, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast to chat with me today.
Excellent. Nice to talk.
I was hoping you'd give a little bit of an intro to yourself. So your name, the organisation you work for, and also I like to always chuck in something that you're passionate about as well.
Yep, no worries. So Michael Hopkins, I'm the Chief Executive of the National Transport Commission. I am passionate about the role of transport in cities. I'm also passionate about the role of data and information for governments in particular to make better transport decisions. And that's been the basis of my last 25 years in work.
Awesome. So you kind of covered it a little bit, but can you explain maybe in a little bit more detail about the role of the National Transport Commission, or the NTC, just to kind of save me from having to repeat that a whole bunch of times?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things we often say is that the National Transport Commission has a wonderfully grandiose title that suggests we do sort of everything. But what we do cover is a little bit more focused than that. So the National Transport Commission was established in 2003. We're a product of Commonwealth law. But while we're a Commonwealth agency in that sense, we're actually responsible to all of Australia's transport ministers. So back in the 90s, our predecessor organisation, the National Roads Transport Commission, was established to essentially try and align the transport regulation across state borders. So we cover only things with wheels, so if it floats or it flies, the Commonwealth and the states look after those. But our role is to work in the space where the Commonwealth doesn't necessarily have any responsibility or constitutional power. The states have the responsibility, but the states have recognised that our transport is increasingly not bound by state borders. Things with wheels cross borders, who knew? So to make sure that the regulation and the law that applies to things that have wheels and cross borders, or alternatively don't cross borders, but we want to apply the same rules to make things easier for people. Our role is to essentially negotiate with states, territories and Commonwealth to come up with a single approach to transport regulation. And you see that in things like the National Heavy Vehicle Law. So there's a single law that applies to heavy vehicles across Australia. That was us. The Australian road rules, which exist as a sort of platonic ideal of what the road rules should be, and then each of the states. And the other big one would be National Rail Safety Law. So that's our role. We're here to build consensus and align Australia's transport regulation.
The NTC recently ran a public consultation on the safe introduction of autonomous vehicles, or high levels of autonomy in vehicles. And
Yes.
That was to support the development of like new national law and policy. So similar to kind of what you've already alluded to. Are you able to give a bit of an overview about what the consultation topics were, and if you had any early takeaways that you might be able to share?
Absolutely. And what I might do, if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about some survey work that we've done as well about public expectations and public perceptions, because
Sure.
The two things go hand in hand quite well. So we've been working on building a national regulatory framework for autonomous vehicles for the past 4 or 5 years. We had a major decision from governments a couple of years ago when they agreed that the overarching law, the autonomous vehicle safety law, would be a piece of Commonwealth law. That means that the Commonwealth government is now in the process of drafting the overarching bill, which will essentially set out the responsibilities of what we're calling the ADSE, the Automatic Driving Systems Entity, and substitute ADS, Automatic Driving System, for driver, essentially. So that bit of work's happening. That creates the, if you like, the macro legal framework. What's missing, though, is what's the connection back to state and territory law, because state and territory law still it is still critical. So the questions we went out to consult on jointly with the Commonwealth, because they're doing the big bit of law, we're doing the stuff with states and territories. So things like the remote operation of autonomous vehicles, when would it be reasonable for a roadside enforcement officer, so usually a police officer, to take control of the vehicle? What responsibilities do we need to put on repairers, maintainers, modifiers? So if we're modifying an autonomous vehicle, what impact might that have on? And you know, we think about vehicle modifications in terms of hardware and tinted windows and physical stuff. But what happens when you start? Is there a scope for modifying the software, and what impact does that have? Trying to get a better understanding of consumer understanding of automated vehicle capabilities, and obligations for drivers, particularly around what we're calling secondary activities. So if I'm sitting in a robo-taxi that doesn't have a steering wheel, you could assume I could safely pick up a book, watch a movie, have a nap if I was, if it was long enough. When we're talking about level 5 autonomy, that's pretty clear. When we're talking about 3 and 4, when there's an obligation for people to perhaps the automatic driving system will pass back control to the human. How are we going to, what controls should there be over what sort of activities that people engage in? And the other big one is, because there's a fair bit of uncertainty about the timing of deployment here, one of the things we're thinking about is, chances are we may not have the whole architecture ready to go on day one, and we start seeing vehicles. So how do we manage some of those risks about early deployment? So that's the sort of the big picture. Some of the big themes that are coming out of this are an understanding, particularly from industry and consumers, that a lot of the things that we're trying to regulate don't exist yet. So it's a little bit hard to know. We've done laws for trucks and trains have been around for 100 years. That's sort of fairly easy to deal with. Where we're talking about technologies that don't exist and that they're in development, we think where we'll end up is more of a general safety duty, where the law imposes a sort of a broad set of duties on you rather than black and white. We think that's where that's going. And also with the issue of what secondary activities can a driver participate in, particularly for level 3 and 4 vehicles. We might start with some fairly broad principles, and then see how the manufacturers manage that sort of transition, handing back to the driver, for example.
I'm definitely trying to contain all my comments because there's definitely a bunch of stuff. I'm particularly glad you mentioned the levels of autonomy, because I think a lot of people don't realize there's actually stages. It doesn't just go from 0 to self-driving. It goes from like all of those little ADAS features that you have involved first that people are probably very familiar with, but not aware that that's like a step in the direction of autonomy. So it's really good that you mentioned that as well. And the data stuff as well, because I know, or the software, I should say, that most vehicles are now basically giant smart devices on 4 wheels or more. So
yes. And in fact, there's a separate bit of work we're doing about the data that comes out of vehicles and what it could be used for. We'd started a couple of years ago, and I have to say we probably started it well before we should have. And government didn't know what it wanted, and industry didn't know what it could deliver. We've started those conversations with industry again, really with a sense of what data do you think do you think will be available from the vehicles, and what are the options for using that, either by governments. And I'm a sort of transport policy nerd of about 25 years, and I just think about all of that data that would help government make good planning decisions and even operational decisions about switching on traffic lights and those sorts of things. So there's a huge opportunity with the data that's available, but there are still some industry concerns about, what else might it be used for, which is entirely reasonable.
So similar, kind of like leading on to that last question about the survey you did about levels of autonomy.
Yeah.
In your experience, what do you think are some of the most critical policy reforms needed to support those high levels of autonomy, and also just like generally improve transport network strategy and planning in Australia? So there's kind of 2 questions in that one, I think.
Yeah, so I think some of if I think about the big questions first, and I'm probably more passionate about the second second part of that question.
Yeah.
But if I think about some of the big questions, it is, if you think about all our current law is obviously entirely built around a driver and driver responsibilities. I've been asked, and it's been put to me, can't we just sort of substitute driver for autonomous driving system in the law? And the answer is, of course, no. Yes, there's a bunch of areas where you can, but we've got a whole lot of other responsibilities that we place on drivers. So being able to pick through those and work out what some of those are, that's what drivers' responsibilities are other than literally, steering the wheel. So those are a big one. Insurance and liability is a big one. And this is one where we've done some work. So the question of how do you build a third-party insurance system, compulsory insurance system like we have in the States here, and how do we adapt the ADS, or how do we adapt that law for ADSEs? And the conclusion there was that the law's actually fairly fit for purpose and will essentially transfer that liability to the autonomous driving system entity, usually probably the OEM, software manufacturer, whoever. So that was a small, relatively easy, but really critical sort of part of the puzzle. For me, I guess the big piece, and it comes with the National Transport Commission's hat really, is how do we make sure that what we do as a package across the nation, and we do in a national sense, and we don't fragment. At the moment, the Australian road laws, which I think I mentioned, exist as model law. So they're sort of they sit as the light on the hill, and across the states and territories, we've got about 98, 99% of those are picked up off the shelf and dropped into local law. There's still a few differences. Bicycles on the footpaths in Brisbane. Melbourne's got hook turns for trams. So, and you can understand some of those, but we really need this to be as consistent as possible. And that's one of the big messages we're getting from the OEMs and industry. And you can understand why. We're not a big market by international standards. And the more that we fragment that market into different state-based requirements, the bigger trouble we'll have.
So slight hook turn maybe in my questions. You are also presenting at the ITS Australia Summit in Sydney, which is on the 13th to the 15th of August.
Yep.
You've got two sessions actually. You've got a keynote, and then you've also got a panel discussion with a bunch of different people from like ANCAP to ITS Indonesia, Maynards WA, Waka Kotahi, and DTP Victoria. What can people expect? Do you have any like sneak previews that you'd be willing to share about the topics you're going to talk about?
It's going to be reasonably similar to what we've talked about. So by that time, we'll have a much better understanding of what's come out of the consultation. So I'm hoping to share some of that. I suspect there'll still be a few policy questions that are still live, and I may not be able to go into where we're heading there because you'll miss the backroom arm wrestle with the states, territories, and industry about where those land. But what I want to do is, and what I think is missing from a lot of the discussion at the moment is an overview of what is the entire sort of legal framework that we'll need from beginning to end. So the way we manage vehicles that come into the country at the moment is different to the way we manage them when they're on the road. So being able to, I guess, give this is where we're heading, this is where we're going. The other thing I'll probably do is go through in some detail some of the research and some of the community research into people's expectations, because we've got some challenges, and those challenges are probably getting harder in the short term. So that's two, and probably the third one to bring it all together is what's happening in industry at the moment. So trends over the last 5 or 6 years, where research dollars is going. So we've seen a bit of a shift away from post-COVID and post the chip shortage. You're seeing that, plus governments having a much more intense focus on decarbonisation. You've seen a big shift in investment and marketing to EVs. But I think importantly, and it's an ITS audience, we're all a bit gung-ho about the role of technology in transport by definition. But I think tempering that with some understanding of how people who aren't us feel about the risks of autonomy and what's shaping that. Because I think some of the overseas experience in areas that are a little bit more laissez-faire, that have had a greater appetite for risks, shall we say, in their sort of testing and live deployment. That's having a real impact on the way Australians feel about this sort of technology. And I think we've got to think about how we deploy here and testing and any sort of live testing as well.
If people wanted to learn more, obviously besides registering for the conference and coming and seeing you speak,
Yep.
How could they learn more about NTC, the work you're doing, or even any other types of connections that you'd like people to be able to make with you or the organisation?
I guess the two sort of obvious ones are, one is our website at ntc.gov.au. We're going through detail with all of our consultations at the moment. So we sit in this sort of intersection of state, Commonwealth, governments and industry. So we spend a lot of time out consulting on everything we do. Because of the way we work, we need a pass mark for us is 9 out of 9 governments. 8 out of 9 is a fail. That means we spend a lot of time listening to the community. So all of our consultation work is there. We've got better over the years. And one of the things I'm always interested in is when people see our consultation materials. We were very good a couple of years ago at releasing 9 discussion papers and legal and exposure drafts of law and those sort of things. So if you're a lawyer in working for a car manufacturer, it's fantastic. If you're a driver who's just interested in what's the future of this, it can be a little bit of a slog. So we've tried to make our consultation pieces a little less lawyerly and a little more human. So they're there. And the other thing I would say is we have a much more accessible links back to our website, things via our LinkedIn. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll get to see not just links back to those consultation things, but some videos of where we've done. I think our last AV industry forum, we've got a video there that sort of takes you through highlights there, but that covers the work program. So follow us on LinkedIn.
Excellent.
I feel like I should be saying, what is it? Press the button, join. And
yeah, subscribe. Press the button below to subscribe or something. Yeah. Perfect. Well, Michael, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast and chatting with me today.
Look, this has been fun. It's nice to sort of break up the day with a conversation that I want to have.
To learn more about any of the guests that we have on the Bite Size podcast, you can check out our show notes at compassiot.substack.com. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the company that runs this podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is compassiot.com.au. Until next time.